and welcome to another episode of Spark Talk. Today we're doing another episode on Iran. We're recording this on the 13th of April, and the latest news is that negotiations between the US and Iran failed on Sunday night, and the US Navy is blockading the Strait of Hormuz as a means of exerting pressure on Iran to capitulate. So far, it is not clear what the response is on part of Iran, and it's also unclear where things will go from here. Now, just about a week ago, Trump was threatening to kill an entire civilization, but then less than 24 hours after that, there was a ceasefire, and everyone, especially on the left, hailed this ceasefire, noting how this represented a victory for Iran and so on. We, I believe, were the only group in the Western Anglophone left who warned that this was a swindle and that we shouldn't be so jolly about what's happening. So today, we want to bring a number of these points together to insist on our warning, why it's a problem to just cheer on Iran, despite the fact that it is able to exert pressure and stand its ground in the face of US aggression. And the thread in talking about all this is really, what's the purpose of communists in this whole conflict? So to discuss this and more, I'm joined by Comrade Vincent. Hello.
Hello, Mansa.
Hello. So, okay, just for the benefit of anybody who is maybe listening to this episode without having heard our previous episodes on Iran, just want to get very clear. We have a side. We're on the side of Iran. We want it to win. Anything elementary that you want to add before we get into sort of talking about what's happening these days or now?
Yeah, I'm not sure we are the only group that, because we published a statement, beware U.S. ceasefire swindle, but certainly the majority of what I've seen on the left or the anti-imperialist media was hailing a victory. Just want to qualify this.
Okay, sorry. That's fine. Thank you. Okay, so how do we want to start this discussion? Do you think we should start from talking about the ceasefire or the current situation? To me, I think they're both completely linked.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's start with the ceasefire itself. Let's lay out a bit the reason we warned about the ceasefire, why we thought it was not necessarily a good news, and why we were so skeptical. For weeks, essentially, the IRGC has said that they were not going to sign exactly this. They were not going to make a ceasefire with no clear guarantee, and they would pursue the struggle against the U.S., until the end, until their demands are met, which is good, obviously. So the announcement of the ceasefire was not exactly a surprise, but a kind of departure from this line of argumentation. So for us, was already a bit of a problem. We warned in our 16 March article. You made an episode with Comrade Perrault exactly on some of the problems of Iran's fighting the U.S. And one of the main things that we warned at the time was, if Iran agrees to a ceasefire without real guarantees, a short-term thing, the U.S. will only be able to rearm, pause in the slaughter, and it will be to the disadvantage of Iran. So obviously that was one of the problems we're looking at. The second problem we are looking is that right as the ceasefire was announced, Israel increased its bombardment of Lebanon. They did an operation in Beirut and around that was absolutely murderous. And were stepping up their war against Hezbollah. Actually, the ceasefire enabled them to divert a lot of their aerial asset onto Lebanon. So that was obviously like a massive problem. And then there was a whole debate about, is Lebanon included in the ceasefire or not? Obviously, I think this was a planned deception by the U.S. and Israel. But the issue that was posed was, will the Iranian leadership throw Hezbollah under the bus, and do a ceasefire only with the Americans and not, including Hezbollah? And there were even demonstrations in the street of Tehran demanding that Hezbollah not be betrayed. So that was the second big warning, that we were like, there's a possibility here, there's a risk that Hezbollah will be betrayed. The Iranian leadership had said that there would be no negotiation as long as Hezbollah was being attacked by Israel. Yet they made it to Islamabad, they sat down with the United States, and they did spend 21 hours. Now, what's our point with all of this is, I think this whole saga of the ceasefire shows that despite a lot of the talks by Iran to want to fight until the end, I think anti-imperialist militants have to be very conscious that there does exist a trend in the Iranian leadership who does want a rapid deal with the United States, who does want to, seek a sort of temporary compromise. And this actually does not bode well, I believe, for the resistance against the United States and against the Zionist state. So that's why we take such a cautious approach. Now, obviously, the talks failed. They haven't sold out, but the risk for me and for us actually remains, and that's why it's important to warn. And that's why I think everybody that's just victory is really not looking at things properly and not actually, I think, making the anti-imperialist duty of, keeping the leadership in check.
Yeah. I would like to talk a little bit about where that pressure comes from, because it was pretty strong that a lot of the left, including just sort of, commentators, anybody critical of the war, which is, a lot of people right now, especially people in the US, they really did see this as oh yeah, Iran's winning. So where does that come from? What is it what's the difference, I guess?
Yeah. Yeah.
What are we seeing that they're not? What are we?
Yeah.
What's the?
All of this, it's a lot of analysis, and I don't want to overwhelm people with analysis, but for me, it boils down that a lot of people are looking at this war with the old framework of, the last 20 years or something. We've discussed this also on this podcast, I believe. And it's Trump said the reason why the Iranian leadership agreed to the ceasefire is because Trump said that the 10-point negotiation plan proposed by the Iranians, which includes a bunch of demands which we support, like the withdrawal of all U.S. forces from the Middle East, the lifting of all sanctions. Trump said that this could be the basis for negotiation, and the Iranian leadership kind of believed them and went for it. And I think a lot of people took that statement by Trump as an admission of defeat. So the problem here for me is that everybody is trusting what Trump says all of a sudden about that ceasefire, which was kind of surprising. And for me, that's just one example of how the left and a lot of anti-imperialists are following this war and are seeing its development from the standpoint of the old framework of trusting the words of the President of the United States, while it's been clear since the genocide in Palestine or even before that whatever Trump says, whoever believes Trump is a fool, that the United States, when it negotiates, it is only to have a pause so that it can rearm and go again on the offensive, that it is constantly deceiving, and that anybody who falls for this is making a huge mistake. And I believe that in the resistance in Iran, there was signs of that mistake, obviously. So for me, that's where the difference comes from. Looking at the war, we're in a different epoch right now from the liberal order, where the US is ready to go really all the way to bring down any of its important strategic competitor, and is ready to do all sorts of trickery and is ready to go through all sorts of destruction and horrible acts, and we must be ready for it. The United States has made clear they want to destroy Iran. So why would you believe all of a sudden that, oh yeah, they're ready to sit down at the table and actually discuss the Iranians' plan without having suffered a huge setback and without having offered any clear guarantees or concessions? For me, that's totally naive. Mm-hmm. So that would be my response.
Yeah. Sorry, the thing that's coming to mind is how Trump picked a fight with the new Pope.
But yeah. Yeah, I saw.
It's just a bit indicative, that the president of the United States, he's calling the guy out, saying, basically, you wouldn't be Pope. Anyways, I just thought it was funny that part of the news cycle is also, Pope Leo, I guess his name is. He's like, no, I don't want to debate with Trump. Why is, it gives you a bit of a sign of how politics is shifting. Mm-hmm. And you can't really be wedded to the same old framework of off ramps and all of that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
But to push back a little bit, I think what's been difficult and a lot of the pressure where it comes from in terms of kind of cheering on Iran and its strategy is that those in charge right now, I don't know who those figures are, but whoever's in charge in Iran right now, they're doing a somewhat effective job of taking that stand and spinning the whole narrative in a way that makes them look tough. For example, as you were saying, the old rules of the liberal world order and trust and so on. But, Iran constantly also says, like, we don't trust you. We don't trust Trump. Like, that's why we're not going to give in on X, Y, and Z question. That's why we still continue to demand, real guarantees. I mean, I don't know what that is, to be honest. But I think part of the pressure is that they continue, and it's been over a month, and they're continuing to maintain this stand, which I think is also a huge factor in terms of disorienting the left.
Yeah, or the Lego songs that are very popular and very effective as well. Anyway.
I haven't been following this.
People who follow will know. No, it could look. You're right. I think a lot of the cheering and a lot of certain of illusions come from the fact, like, look, we must recognize it. Iran has put serious pressure on the United States and Israel. Its control of the Strait of Hormuz was really hurting the United States. Its strikes, although they're not able to strike the U.S. mainland, obviously, but they were still hurting really U.S. troops and Israeli troops in the region. But that's even more the problem. The ceasefire intervened at a point where there was increasing pressure on the Israeli and U.S. army. But look, we have to be frank. The Iranian government has been able to put up a pretty good fight in many ways against Israel and the United States. They have put quite a lot of pressure on U.S. troops, on Israeli troops, on the Gulf countries as well. Their control of the Strait of Hormuz was really starting to hurt the global economy. But this is precisely the problem. It's at this moment that the ceasefire intervened. This is why the U.S. wanted a ceasefire, to regroup, pause, and retake the initiative. And now the U.S. blockading the Strait of Hormuz has basically taken out of the table one of Iran's biggest leverage in a certain sense. And they needed a few days of pause to be able to put that in place, which the ceasefire provided. So what's the point here? The point in general, like, we have a side in this war, but to wage a war against the United States, you really need a strategy whose end goal is really the defeat of the U.S. empire as a whole. Now, what does this mean concretely in the region? It means that we must be able to effect enough setback to the United States and to Israel for them to really be able to retreat, and for Iran to really be able to negotiate in the strongest position. Now, I believe accepting this ceasefire has weakened Iran's position, at least temporarily. Now, it doesn't mean Iran will, fold right away. It doesn't mean the U.S. is winning the war. They're certainly not. It's not going that well for them, but it does mean that anti-imperialist militants have to look at the Iranian government with critical eyes, understanding that this is a regime, if I can call it. I know anti-imperialists hate that word, but it's a regime or government, whatever you want to call it, that's stuck between U.S. imperialism attacking and stuck between a people in Iran, many of which hate them, many of which are really opposed to them, and a regime who has quite conservative interests in many ways. So it fights its battle balancing these two interests and cannot really pursue a full-on consistent strategy. That's our main disagreement, actually, with the Islamic Republic's leaders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's what's key, and that's the point I'd like to draw out a little bit more in the rest of this discussion. Like, if listeners who are either familiar or who want to go check out what we've said on the war, but also in Iran, because right before the war, guess what the regime did? It massively cracked down on protesters at home. But I think to understand how, despite that, we continue to have a side with Iran, like, you really have to have a Marxist perspective, which bottom line means that we take a side with an oppressed country in opposition to imperialism, but we're not supporting its strategy, because its strategy, as you just laid out, precisely because it's squeezed between these two more powerful forces, precisely because it does not seek, the end of the defeat of U.S. imperialism, or even if it seeks, it doesn't have the strategy to implement it, right? That's why its strategy either turns, inwards against opposition at home, or, isolating its allies on the field of battle, like with Hezbollah, or, looking for opportunities for ceasefire. So I think that's sort of the broader picture. I want to link what you've been saying to the situation now. Now, I mean, I'll be very honest. I find it difficult to figure out where this is going to go. Like, are we going to see another escalation? Is there going to be resumption of, full-on war again, or what? But how do you see what you've been saying about the ceasefire and the weakness of the regime's strategy, the problems with it, to where it finds itself now? Maybe we can start with a little bit of what the U.S. sees. Why is the U.S. blockading the strait? To obviously exert pressure, as I said, on the Strait of Hormuz. But how does this figure into the overall strategy to get Iran to capitulate?
Well, the control of the strait was one of the main lever of the Islamic Republic in this war, really, and the blockade just takes that out of the table. Now, obviously, that's going to do untold damage in the world economy. I think we can expect like a huge shock. It's hard to see where it's going to go, because some people say the blockade is about bringing Iran back to the negotiating table, which is likely. It depends what Iran will do in retaliation. It could just full on restart the war, and then we would just go back to the war at a higher intensity, at a higher level of escalation. But it could very well be that there are more talks following that blockade. I mentioned already our 16 March article. I just want to quote from it. We wrote on 16 March that, discussing Iran's ability to resist the U.S., we said, okay, maybe if they continue, to strike Israel, stand fast, continue the war, they could be in a very good position. And we said, if on the contrary, Iran once again accepts a settlement when convenient for the U.S., we will likely see only a pause until the next round of attack. Moreover, in such a scenario, the damage Iran will have inflicted will surely pale in comparison to the devastating long-term impact of the bombing campaign on Iranian society. As such, a lot hinges on the IRGC's ability and determination to pursue and escalate the conflict. So we had sort of called it in a sense. So how does that help us understand what's next? That last sentence that I read is really important. The lot hinges on the determination of the Iranian leadership to actually go through. There is clearly, when we talked about the regime, quote unquote, there's clearly different elements in it which reflect different pressure in Iranian society. There were actually elements inside the Iranian government who were against that ceasefire, or at least worried about it. Certainly Hezbollah was probably not very happy to hear that. And there are many elements, I'm not sure I would say to the left, but at least who are more leaning on the more anti-imperialist wing of the government, who were against that ceasefire, who thought we should have continued the war and will surely push for a new escalation in response to the strait. And then there is a wing that actually is much more conciliatory, that has existed for a long time. So I think the battle, which obviously we're not privy to, but the internal battle inside the government is going to be very important to know what's going to be the next step. The second element I think that will be important in this entire blockade will be China, actually. And I just want to introduce this point on China. Allegedly is an ally or is supporting Iran in this war. It's unclear to what extent. A little bit of material aid, some satellite footage. However, China was quite key to put pressure on the Iranian to accept the ceasefire, which I think was quite a treacherous role, given the fact that the ceasefire was only based on vague promises and included no clear concessions. However, now the U.S., by blockading the Strait of Hormuz, has basically blocked one of China's main supply of oil. So even when Iran when it was Iran that was blocking the Strait of Hormuz, they were letting oil going to China go through. And China depends quite a lot of its oil from the Gulf, the Persian Gulf. Now, this has been shut. And it's unclear again to me what will be China's reaction, but this is kind of a key attack on its interests. In general, throughout the last few years, people have talked about China as if it is playing this sort of long-term, very smart game of not doing anything and letting the U.S. destroy in chaos. But I think that's a proof that this is actually not quite of a smart strategy in general, because the U.S. keeps attacking, pushing, and now China could face real shortages of oil in the not too distant future. And so for me, what China will do is actually quite key, because once again, China has a lot of ability, short even of a conflict with the U.S., to actually put a lot of pressure on the U.S. to stop this war. The question is, will they exert it? And you get back to the same point that we keep making. A lot of people look at this war with objective factors only. What's the position of Iran? What's the position of the U.S.? How many interceptors they have? How many planes have they gunned down? Actually, the determining factor here is really one of leadership. Will the leadership really use its strongest hand to force the U.S. into a crisis and to force the U.S. into real concession? And that's a question both for the IRGC and China, the People's Republic, I think.
Yeah, and I think as far as China goes, I mean, look at everything it's been doing since, I don't know, since Trump 2.0. You know, everything has been geared towards maintaining, hanging on to the order that the Americans are really hell-bent on destroying, you know? And within this, you know, we've made this point constantly about China that, you know, throughout the genocide of the Palestinians, it did nothing. With Iran, where is the actual real material aid? Venezuela.
Yeah.
You know, where
I mean, it
China?
kept trade with Israel and tried to keep good relation with Israel. And it's even worse than that.
Precisely. So I actually appreciate the point that this is really about leadership, because I think that's where you know, again, this is a leftist podcast, but that's really where the rubber hits the road. You can analyze everything, but in terms of, we are talking about class interests, we're talking about, you know, fighting imperialism. What matters here is the will, the political will and the strategy to do that. Not so, I mean, the material hardware is also important, but ultimately it's subordinated to how and who's willing to use it where, you know? So I think that's kind of key. And, you know, on this score, the left doesn't analyze the war in this sense, but also in terms of its own role, the left doesn't see itself as fighting to take leadership of the anti-imperialist struggle from the IRGC. And I think that's the big problem in terms of what
that's the difficulty. And there's obviously a lot of pressure because you don't want to appear like, you know, criticizing too much those who are fighting under the gun of U.S. imperialism. And, you know, it's true that we stand, you know, side by side in complete solidarity. However, the point of Marxism has to be to struggle for a Marxist strategy to advance the struggle of workers, the struggle of the oppressed. And actually, this war so far shows, or is starting to show, I believe, the problems of not having won. You know, the IRGC or the Iranian government, I'm far from a specialist, but is really looking at this war, okay, how they can bring back some deterrence and put an end to this conflict with some guarantees. Meanwhile, the other side, Trump is completely determined to destroy the country completely. China, same thing, is looking for temporizing, to hope to go back to the old international order based on liberal rules and free flow of commerce. Meanwhile, Trump is tearing up all those rules. So we're facing a very determined America who has actually a clear plan in mind. You know, everybody says they don't have a plan. They do have a plan. It's to maintain U.S. hegemony and crush Iran, crush China, and crush Russia to a certain extent. And that's actually quite of a clear plan. And if it means putting the whole world into chaos, including the global economy, by the way, because although the U.S. would be hurt by an economic crisis, because they control all the flows of capital, they can actually cushion themselves much more than many other countries, Iran included. We should not underestimate them, and you actually need a proper strategy whose end goal is the destruction of the U.S. empire, but really organize the steps, step by step, with that end goal in mind, if that's not too abstract.
Yeah. Well, I was going to come to this, but just anecdotally, I was speaking with some relatives actually over the last few days in India, and I was asking about the situation with the fuel because, you know, obviously in huge parts of the global south, the whole energy crisis has been felt, you know, super concretely. Mm-hmm. And this is less so in terms of, you know, at the petrol pump, as they say, cooking fuel, right? So my folks out in the village, they have to wait 45 days to get a gas cylinder, which is how you cook, you know. And there's just, I asked, I was like, well, is the government doing anything? You know, nothing, because they can't do anything. What's India going to do? Nothing. They can't do anything. So if you're in the towns and the cities, you are on a 25-day waiting list or something like that. But in the villages, obviously, second-class citizens, they wait 45 days to get gas cylinders. And this, you know, imagine, this impacts your ability to eat. It impacts your ability, you know, it's just a very concretely felt thing. Now, obviously, I mean, I think that's just to give a bit of a sense of how in the West, these countries have more of an ability to shield themselves and their economies from the effect, but that is not so true for countries of the global South. And I do think that that's also one of the places where we can see like things, heating up, possibly as a result, as one of the consequences of the war, and that's something we should be paying attention to. But I wanted to come back and talk a little bit about just what you left off there with, that, maybe it's too abstract. One of the things we tend to get some comments, some feedback on our podcasts. A trend often is like, so easy to say all these criticisms, but who's actually fighting on the ground, Like, it's much easier to criticize while there's actually somebody's actually standing up to the US. And I do think that that's not a easy argument to answer. I'll just be honest. So to whoever is going to listen and comment, I'm actually taking their argument up. I think you've said this a number of times already, but just to make it very explicit, we are in solidarity. We want Iran to win in this. But I think where we're coming from is not just an attitude of poo-pooing everything, or not just to breed demoralization, but actually to insist on what is an actual strategy to win. I mean, just step back and look at the big picture. Like, Iran has been squeezed for decades through sanctions. Why? Half of Iranians hate the regime. Why? Look at the whole Middle East. It's pitted against each other. Why? How are you actually going to fight and defeat the US? So, I mean, some people might think some of the points we're making are academic or abstract, but the point is, what actually needs to be done? I think, I don't know, maybe that's not enough, but I did want to just raise that and get your feedback, because I understand some of those people's frustration. I disagree with it completely, because bottom line, what's your point as a communist? What's your point as a socialist? Why do you exist? If the IRGC can fight and defeat the US, why am I out here being a socialist? What is my purpose? Literally nothing,
Yeah, it's a hard criticism. Look, I'm sorry, I would like to do more to help the resistance. But look, let's take the IRGC. Let's take the IRGC as at its own word. They have said for weeks, we will not settle for like a baseless and vague ceasefire. Good. Yet this ceasefire was based on vague promises without any sort of guarantees. So they did that. Then they said, we will not negotiate as soon as if Lebanon and Hezbollah continue to be pounded. Well, they did sit down with the US as Hezbollah was being pounded. So, and then you can even extend this thing of like, since the beginning of the genocide in Gaza, it is quite known in the anti-imperialist milieu in the Palestinian resistance that like everybody was waiting for Iran to come in, and they temporized, tried to gain time, negotiations, which put them in a weaker position.
I mean, honestly, if I was to be blunt, they sat by while the genocide happened. I'm sorry, but that's like really it.
Yeah,
Some people might take issue with that, but let's look at it. Okay, fine, they must have done this or that or the other thing, but like, come on, Israel was going crazy, and they.
Yeah, it's true. So that sequence of event led to the first 12-day war. Now this war, every time the US punches harder and deeper, withdraws whenever they want, and the other side accepts, and then you get into deeper into this cycle. So what's the message here? We're not trying to poo-poo. We're trying to warn anti-imperialist fighters that if you just have blind trust in this force, there is a big chance that you might be betrayed, and there's a big chance that the country might end up being in a much weaker position. So what does that point to? It points to the need to organize yourself independently from this leadership. Try to build an alternative pole that can actually push back and mobilize real forces when betrayal or risk of is posed. So I don't know, that doesn't answer the argument that, yeah, we're far away, that's true. But also, I think we talk about Iran, and we can talk and make other podcasts about the work we've been doing also in the West. We take part in demonstration, and I think there's a lot that can be said actually about the role of communists in the West. I think one of the problems with the narrative that Iran is winning as well, is that it totally makes, it leads to passivity, It means you don't have to do anything, here in Britain or in the United States or in the imperialist countries, because you know what? Iran is winning, so you don't need it. Actually, a conscious strategy of Iran, if I can make another point, should be to try to point a way forward that actually here's how you can help the resistance. Here's what you can do in your own country to help. In Britain, for example, is very simple. Starmer says that this is not our war, yet British military bases throughout Britain are used daily for flights of American planes to bombard Iran, or at least were before that whole ceasefire saga, and will resume soon. There needs to be a campaign against that. So it's important to push back against this whole narrative that they're winning, because it pushes like, well, we don't need to do anything then. You just sit back, watch Al Jazeera all day, and oh wow, they're winning. Well, no, I'm sorry, that's not how the anti-imperialist struggle is built. And Iran, frankly, the Iranian resistance movement should push back against that. That actually, no, it's not going to be that easy,
Yeah. Yeah, and I think again, this comes back down to the tasks of revolutionaries, and like on part of like a real genuine anti-imperialist leadership in Iran would be trying to find ways of mobilizing the Western working classes to exert more pressure on the imperialist governments. So to create chaos at home, not chaos, but strikes, etc., like shutdowns of things, etc. But that's not happening. And I really do appreciate that point about passivity at home, because that's been one of the points that, how do we fight for example, to liberate Palestine while sitting in Britain or in the US? How do we fight to defend Iran? Like, concretely, it does mean that we have a job. Like, part of it is to actually insist on the Marxist principles of like, well, let's not just like throw a lot into the IRGC, but also, for example, concretely, that means fighting to shut down the bases in Britain and in its bases abroad, etc. Do you want to flesh out a little bit of the implications for what what does it mean to defend Iran in the West?
I think that's important because you have to be concrete about this. In Britain itself, it's not so much like, we can make point about the IRGC and the Iranian government, but that's not what we spent the most of our time actually arguing about this war. In Britain, for example, there's all these bases. We need a movement to shut down those bases. And that would actually hamper the U.S. bombing campaign very, very concretely. But the problem, and what we spend most of our time arguing about and fighting about on the left, is that the leaders of the left, the leaders of the trade unions, will not take any actions to put the Labour government in a difficult situation. They might say words sometimes, they might even criticize those bases, but they're not going to take any steps that are going to put the Labour government in a difficult position. Same thing in Germany. There is a movement against huge American bases there. There's American soldiers all over Europe. And in the US itself, this is the home base. There are countless ways, even indirect ways, in which the war effort can be hampered and actually tied very easily to the standard of living of working people. I'll mention, for example, just also in Ireland at the moment, it's not very covered in the press so much, but there are actually growing protests against the rise of fuel, led by farmers notably, but also even small businesses. But it has been joined by many, many layers of people. Anyway, I'm not going to get too much into it, but these are the kind of spark that we will see with this war that we must exploit to aid the war effort. So defending Iran, that doesn't mean just writing pieces of paper that says defend Iran. It's to try to be concrete about whatever ways your country is fueling the war effort, what can be done by mobilizing broader social power to block this. I don't know if that's concrete. I mean, we can, not a specialist of every country. Like I know Britain, I know the US a bit, but yeah, that's about it. I mean, but that has to be made concrete. And in those countries, it's always the same thing, because leaders of the working class movement will always try to shield the government or the powers that be, not to cross the red lines of the capitalist class. And really the task of communists there is to really hit sharply against that and expose them, and tie this also to the livelihood of people. That's also a thing, like not just to be about Iran, but to expose in front of everyone how this is a war of the US to really reassert its hegemony, and how this will be done at the expense of your standard of living, which it's kind of obvious to demonstrate, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. No, I do really appreciate that point. I think that's really important. I actually don't think I myself had considered that angle so much in terms of preparing this discussion myself, but really the completely liquidationist implications of just being like, victory for Iran. The IRGC has beat the US. Well, first of all, it hasn't. It's not winning. But that this has far-reaching implications, not just for your anti-imperialist strategy, and the war, but also for what you were doing at home. So where is the fight? Actually, Starmer comes out looking kind of good. I think this war has kind of saved him a little bit. I don't know. But I've seen some headlines that say this because people are like, oh, well, he's saying no, he's taking a stand.
Yeah.
Like today he's saying, oh, no, the UK won't be joining the Strait of Hormuz blockade. And I think this has kind of been able to give him a little bit of a lifeboat. I don't know. You're probably a better judge of this. You follow the
a little bit, in the polls. It has risen a bit, but I think it's kind of funny because he sort of sleepwalked into this position. Like he didn't try to take a strong stance. He just not openly joined. Although the UK is, let's be clear, are helping massively the US, but he says on out loud that they're not going to join, and somehow it started to help his poll a little bit. But I doubt it's going to save him. But yeah, if I can just make a point on this, that's the anti-imperialist struggle, and that would be also a criticism that can be put to the Iranian leadership or to the anti-imperialist media in general. In the end of the day, the strongest weapon of the anti-imperialist struggle is if it can put masses into motion. That's the first of all, that's the only way to if you want to talk about expelling US forces out of the Middle East, the only way you're going to get that is with huge, massive and popular movement based on a class appeal against this. It's not true that if you wait for the sheikh and the emirs to say to the US, oh, please leave our country, as the Iranian government has asked multiple times, that's never going to happen. So it's to put the masses in motion. And I do think that what could be decisive in this war is if there is a real reaction to the economic mayhem the blockade is going to create in the United States. That is actually something the United States is not shielded so much. Inflation and economic crisis, a huge price of oil. The U.S. has multiple means in which it can put those costs on other shoulders on the planet. But an actual uprising or a huge class struggle in the United States, that's what can really put the U.S. into a huge difficulties.
Yeah. And we have seen a little bit of uptick of strikes, I guess, in the United States. But again, it boils down to where will it be channeled? Where will that anger be channeled? Whether you're talking about in the United States or in the Middle East or, or in any of the sort of global South countries that are really being absolutely squeezed by the energy crisis. Where will that go if you don't have a strategy that can bridge the divisions that exist, which are massive?
Yeah.
And if the clerical regimes are able to get on top of this and channel that resentment to their own ends, like that will not be a good outcome. But a strategy which makes the point about, okay, to really decisively defeat the US, you need unity of the masses, and the masses united, against a particular singular target, which is the US, and this is how this should unfold, et cetera, and, also in the West, then we're talking about something different.
Yeah.
But again, this is where the left fails, which is they'll see an uprising. They'll be like, oh, yeah, uprising. We saw this with the Gen Z revolutions, which they hailed and then they went nowhere and now nobody talks about them.
Yeah, indeed. And it goes for inside Iran as well. Many people like to compare this war with the Vietnam War. And, the U.S. is facing a second Vietnam and okay, there might be some truth, I hope. But one of the big difference between the North Vietnam and the Islamic Republic is that in North Vietnam you had a social revolution. You had both the liberation of the country from imperialism as well as the liberation of workers and peasants from capitalist exploitation. And this is what galvanized millions upon millions of Vietnamese to fight U.S. imperialism. The whole nation could be mobilized in a sort of united front. That's not the situation in Iran. There are one of the source of discontent is the massive corruption, the parasitism of layers of the economy. Obviously, an anti-imperialist pole in the country would want to hit at that, saying, no, we need to focus all the resources of the country to its defense, which requires going against those big interests, those owned by the IRGC or owned by religious institutions, which play a massive role in the economy and quite parasitic role, I should say. They're diverting resources, and that would be a way to galvanize the entire people behind both in the war to defeat U.S. imperialism, but for their own emancipation.
Not to mention the huge repression, which, again,
Well,
the
yeah.
regime itself builds obstacles in uniting and mobilizing the nation behind its aims.
Of course.
Currently.
Yeah.
Okay, so look, it remains to be seen what's next. But I think for me, if there was one thing I could summarize from this, is you really have to see this war from the point of view of, as you said, the political will. Does the regime have the will to continue and, to try and push back against the US as much as possible? And I think it's the events of the past few weeks sort of taking opportunities to come to the negotiating table. That doesn't sound like it does. I think the dangers of capitulation that you've warned against, and ultimately, bottom line, to look at this from the point of view of what will it really take to kick the US out of the region. It will take a different kind of leadership, which is committed to that aim and is able to mobilize people behind that aim. And the left, in just uncritically saying that Iran is winning, does it and the masses a great disservice. I think that for me is the main message that I would like readers to get out of this. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
There's surely multiple points, but I think that's the main point. Yeah. I think you've summarized it quite well.
Okay. Right. So beware of US ceasefire swindle. That was from last week. I'll link it in the show notes. But I do urge listeners to go and read the article, Don't Underestimate US Imperialism, which, again, depending on where you're coming from, you can either find it quite refreshing, or you can think that it's very demoralizing, because it really depends on how you're looking at the whole situation. But for us, it remains important to really insist that we cannot judge these wars using the old playbooks. Mm-hmm. And the US is hell-bent on doing anything it needs to do to stay on top. And so don't underestimate US imperialism. I'll link that stuff in the show notes as well. We did a previous episode. We'll link all of that. And I will leave it here. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks to you. Always a pleasure. Okay. Bye.
Well, I ain't got no smoke, at least not with you. And I don't know if you don't know, but there are just a few of oligarchs and capitalists profiting massive profits, holding us down in